The silence before the gavelet was a crisp Monday morning in Washington, D.C., when the news broke that Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook and CEO of Meta, was going to personally represent himself in a federal court case. The internet was quick to mock. Headlines across digital tabloids lit up with satire. Tech titan turns lawyer. Zuck's new algorithm is legalese. Memes poured in by the minute. Photoshopped images of Mark in a powdered wig, defending himself with a glowing keyboard or arguing with a holographic judge inside the metaverse. Twitter laughed. Late-night hosts chuckled. Even seasoned journalists assumed it was some kind of PR stunt. But inside Zuckerberg's corner office at Meta, HQ in Menlo Park, the atmosphere was anything but playful. What had begun as a business misunderstanding had escalated into something far more personal and quietly, profoundly meaningful. 6 months earlier, Meta had faced an internal ethical dispute over the acquisition of a small but revolutionary startup called Ethic AI, a firm that specialized in developing transparency algorithms for content moderation. The startup, founded by a young Tanzanian-American coder named Neema Amari, had created something truly rare, a code architecture that allowed for decision explainability in artificial intelligence, making it possible for AI-generated outcomes to be translated into human logic in plain English, with bias minimization steps clearly documented. Meta's acquisition of Ethic AI, initially viewed as routine, had spiraled into controversy when Neema's original codebase was discovered to have been quietly replaced by a modified, stripped-down version after the buyout. The modification appeared to remove key transparency features, allegedly at the direction of a mid-level Meta executive with connections to third-party ad agencies. It was a bureaucratic misfire, not a top-level conspiracy, but Neema wasn't interested in headlines. She filed suit not to punish, but to make a point. If you strip the ethics out of AI, it stops being a tool and becomes a weapon. Rather than delegate the defense to Meta's high-powered legal team, Mark made a shocking internal decision. He would represent the company himself. Not out of arrogance, not even as a symbolic gesture, but because something about Neema's courage stirred him in a place few had seen before. Somewhere behind the algorithms and the quarterly earnings, he remembered why he started Facebook in the first place. Not to control the world, but to connect it. When he made the announcement to his board, silence fell like a thunderclap. Some executives protested, citing optics, potential legal risk, even stock price damage. Others leaned in with curiosity. Mark had never been formally trained in law, but over the years, he had sat through more legal briefings than most defense attorneys had in a lifetime. More importantly, he had something no law school could teach, an obsessive clarity of thought and a deeply personal sense of accountability. "I'm not doing this for Meta," he told the board in a private meeting. "I'm doing it for the truth of the story we're writing." The courtroom was modest. Federal District Court, 10th Circuit, Room 214. Its wood-paneled walls, worn benches, and dull lighting betrayed no sense of the global attention now orbiting the building. Security lined the halls. Press swarmed the steps. Protesters waved signs both for and against Mark. And there, seated at the defense table in a plain grey suit with no entourage, sat the CEO of Meta. Quiet, still, and composed. The opposing counsel, a sharp-tongued litigator named Miriam Ellis, had 30 years of experience and a reputation for making tech CEOs squirm. She entered the courtroom with fire in her stride, flanked by a team of junior associates, confident that she would dismantle Zuckerberg in a matter of days. She even joked to the clerk during pre-trial motions, "Maybe he'll code us a defense." Instead of speaking it, the judge, a stern, pragmatic woman named Honorable Judge Clarissa Holt, cracked a rare smile at the remark. She'd presided over tech cases before, but never one where the defendant was also the billionaire at the heart of Silicon Valley's digital empire. Her first impression of Mark wasn't flattering. He looked robotic, too calculated. She imagined this was just another rich executive trying to manipulate the system with theater. But what she didn't know, what no one yet realized, was that Mark had spent the last 6 months not preparing a legal defense, but studying, privately, obsessively. He had read over 900 legal documents, not just about IP and contract law, but about ethics, digital rights, corporate responsibility, and precedent from cases as old as the Sherman Act to as recent as Europe's GDPR battles. He had interviewed ethicists, historians, and even former litigants in similar cases. He didn't want to win by loophole. He wanted to learn the language of law as deeply as he had learned code, and to write a new kind of syntax that fused responsibility with power. As the opening statements began, the air in the courtroom turned dense with expectation. Miriam delivered a precise, persuasive introduction, laying out how Meta had knowingly devalued Ethic AI's transparency features for profit. She painted the picture of a Goliath swallowing a David and silencing their conscience. The gallery nodded. The press scribbled. Nima watched quietly, her face unreadable. Then it was Mark's turn. He stood slowly, without notes, without a screen, just a folder in his hand. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm and even, "I'm not here to deny mistakes. I'm not here to hide behind procedure. I'm here to take responsibility for something bigger than code, bigger than Meta, and even bigger than this courtroom." A hush fell over the room. He continued, explaining in accessible, compelling language what had happened. The organizational miscommunication, the executive overreach, and most importantly, how it reflected not a conspiracy, but a critical flaw in how scale divorces itself from integrity. He admitted failure. He named names, not to pass blame, but to show transparency. And then he did something no one expected. He pulled out a printed copy of the original Ethic AI code, unmodified, annotated, and handed it to the judge, requesting that it be entered into evidence on behalf of the plaintiff. The courtroom murmured. The judge raised an eyebrow. "You're offering this against yourself?" she asked. "Yes," he replied, "because hiding truth is a bigger crime than losing a case." The judge leaned back, studying him. And for the first time, the glimmer of skepticism in her eyes began to soften, not into admiration, but into curiosity. Perhaps he wasn't playing defense at all. Perhaps he was building something, not with software, not with PR, but with principle. Code of honor. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted in the days that followed Mark Zuckerberg's unexpected opening statement. What had begun as a case about intellectual property and corporate overreach was now evolving into something deeper, something moral, human, and strangely intimate. The media still camped outside, feeding headlines that swung between awe and skepticism. But inside that modest federal room, a different story was unfolding, one not of profit margins but of principle. One where a man who had once been accused of building walls between people was now attempting to tear down the invisible ones within his own company and himself. Judge Clarissa Holt, who had walked into the case with the expectation of presiding over another tightly contested legal wrestling match, found herself watching a defendant who didn't behave like one. Zuckerberg wasn't there to perform nor to deflect. He moved slowly, listened intently, and spoke with a kind of calm humility that didn't try to impress, it tried to illuminate. His voice never raised, even when the prosecution cornered him with aggressive questioning. His tone never turned, defensive, even when the motives of his entire company were called into question. But most curiously, he never once referred to Meta as they. He always said we. It was during the second day of proceedings that Miriam Ellis, the plaintiff's lead counsel, attempted to dismantle that calm. She brought out internal meta-memos, emails between product managers, and charts showing the sharp spike in ad revenue coinciding with the moment the Ethic AI transparency module was removed. Her cross-examination was fiery, articulate, and surgically precise. "Mr. Zuckerberg," she said, pacing in front of the jury with the theatrical flair of a seasoned litigator, "you claim this was a misunderstanding, a mid-level decision made without your knowledge. But you're the CEO. The buck stops with you. How do you explain the financial gains your company enjoyed at the very moment transparency was compromised?" There was a long silence. All eyes were on him. The courtroom was so still that even the hum of the ceiling fan felt loud. Then, Mark. He spoke, slowly, not with rebuttal but with reflection. "I can't explain it in a way that makes it acceptable," he began. "What I can do is admit that when systems scale too fast, accountability tends to get outsourced. Not to other people, but to abstraction. The system did it. The algorithm caused it. But people make systems. People train algorithms. And I allowed a culture to grow where impact was measured in speed, not clarity." Miriam raised her eyebrows. "So you admit negligence?" "No," Mark said. "I admit blindness. And now I'm doing what the law requires and what leadership demands. I'm owning that blindness." A ripple moved through the room. Judge Holt said nothing, but for the first time she leaned slightly forward in her chair. Not out of suspicion, but attention. There was something happening here, something the law rarely witnessed, a man using the courtroom not as a shield, but as a scalpel to dissect his own failures. But Mark wasn't finished. He stood from the table and made an unusual request. "Your Honor," he said, "I would like to call a witness not on my official list, someone the plaintiff is not expecting. She has not been subpoenaed and has no legal obligation to testify, but I believe her voice will add truth to this case." Miriam objected immediately, but Judge Holt allowed the deviation, intrigued. The courtroom door opened, and in walked Nima. Amarid, the founder of Ethic AI, the plaintiff, the woman who had filed the suit. She wasn't expected to speak until the final phase, and certainly not from the defense's side. She took the stand quietly. Her appearance was unassuming. Jeans, a navy blazer, minimal makeup, but her presence filled the room. Her eyes were sharp with clarity and courage. When the clerk asked her to swear the oath, she didn't blink. She simply said, "I do," with a voice that held the weight of 1,000 lines of code and the dreams they carried. Mark didn't approach the witness stand. He simply asked one question. "Nima, if this courtroom didn't exist, if this lawsuit never happened, and it was just you and me in a room, no titles, no lawyers, what would you want to say?" There was a pause. Then Nima looked at him, and the room disappeared. She wasn't speaking to a billionaire or a CEO. She was speaking to a builder who had once forgotten the foundation. "I'd tell you that when you acquired Ethic AI, I was excited. Not for the money, but because I thought we had a chance to scale transparency across the internet. But within months, the transparency protocol was gone, not disabled, erased. You called it a technical migration. I called it betrayal. I felt like I gave you a compass, and you buried it in the dirt." Mark nodded. "And now?" She hesitated. "I still think you failed," she said plainly. "But not because you're evil or careless. You failed because you mistook complexity for integrity. You thought ethics could be baked into a product after launch. But ethics isn't an update. It's the architecture." There was a long silence. Then she added, "But you're here now, listening, owning it, and that's rare." The judge finally spoke. "Ms. Amari, are you retracting your lawsuit?" Nima shook her head. "No, Your Honor, but I'm revising my hope. This was never about money or punishment. It was about responsibility. If that begins here, in this room, with this man, then maybe we're already halfway there. That day, the courtroom didn't erupt. It softened. The tone shifted from conflict to clarity, and the news cycle, so used to dramatic victories or humiliating defeats, found itself trying to cover something else entirely: accountability without collapse. In the days that followed, Mark called witnesses no one expected: employees who had disagreed with Meta leadership, transparency watchdogs who had once written critical op-eds about him, and even his own internal AI ethicist who had tried and failed to prevent the code alterations. None of them were there to defend him. They were there to show a fuller picture, and Mark never interrupted them, never challenged their critiques. He simply stood by and let the record speak, even when it painted him in flawed light. And in that something miraculous happened. The judge, the jury, even the media began to witness a man not trying to win a trial, but to transform a truth. And that kind of victory couldn't be measured by verdicts alone. When the cross-examinations ended and closing arguments were set to begin, Judge Holt requested both teams to meet in her chambers. No press, no cameras, just clarity. "You've both presented more than a legal argument," she said. "You've presented a reckoning. This courtroom was built to settle disputes. But what's unfolded here is the start of something else. Not a judgment, but a model. I don't know how I'll rule yet. But I know this. What you've demonstrated is bigger than law. It's human evolution." When they left the chambers, neither side felt like winners or losers, just participants in something rare, an act of public humility and shared courage. And as the final phase approached, Mark sat quietly at his table, fingers resting gently on the edge of his notes, not looking at strategy, but at an old email he had forwarded to himself months ago. A message he'd once received from a college professor he'd long since forgotten. The subject line was a quote: "Justice is not just about punishment, it's about restoration. And restoration requires vulnerability from both sides." He had laughed when he first read it. Now it made perfect sense, and he was ready for whatever came next. The closing argument. The morning of the closing arguments arrived, not with the buzz of media frenzy or the usual frenzy of high-profile litigation, but with a kind of hushed reverence. The air inside the courtroom felt different, thicker, heavier, not with tension, but with significance. It was as though everyone, from the jury to the spectators, from the clerk to the judge herself, sensed that what had been unfolding over the past week was no longer a conventional legal battle. It had become something else entirely: a reckoning of values, of leadership, and of the soul of an industry that had too often confused innovation with invincibility. Mark Zuckerberg arrived early. He wore no tie. His suit was the same simple grey he had worn every day of the trial, not out of performative modesty, but from a desire to remove distraction. This wasn't about image. This wasn't about proving who was right. It was about revealing what had been wrong, and doing it in a way that allowed healing, not just headlines. He had spent the night in silence, not rehearsing his argument, but rereading Nima Mari's original white paper, the document that had introduced Ethic AI's framework to the world. It was brilliant, direct, and breathtakingly human. It reminded him why he had first wanted to bring her into the Meta ecosystem, not for her code, but for her clarity. When the court reconvened, the judge looked over her glasses with an unusual softness. She had spent most of her career presiding over fraud cases, patent wars, and digital trade secrets. Never had she witnessed a trial where the defendant turned the courtroom into a confessional, not for absolution, but for understanding. The prosecution spoke first. Miriam Ellis was methodical, unwavering. She recapped the paper trail, the lost functionality, the harm caused by a loss of transparency in Meta's algorithm. She reminded the jury that goodwill and humility, while admirable, did not erase accountability. Her closing was a masterclass in legal discipline, structured, sharp, and sobering. Then it was Mark's turn. He rose from his seat without a single sheet of paper. The courtroom was so silent that even the shifting of a chair sounded like thunder. He walked to the center of the room, not looking at the jury directly, but at the floor, as if gathering strength from the ground beneath his feet. Then he raised his eyes, not with fire but with focus. "I'm not here today to ask for exoneration," he began. "I'm here to ask for participation in something bigger than law, bigger than this courtroom, something we've all been a part of, whether we knew it or not. The shaping of a digital world that is now as real, sometimes more real, than the one we physically walk through every day." He paused, scanning the faces around him, some skeptical, some moved, all listening. "I've spent 2 decades building tools meant to connect people. But connection, I've learned, is not just about access, it's about accountability. We often say we're moving fast and breaking things, and somewhere along the way, we forgot that what breaks doesn't always fix itself. Sometimes it breaks people. Sometimes it breaks trust." Mark walked slowly, deliberately. "When we acquired Ethic AI, we had the opportunity to bring something rare and necessary into the mainstream. Explainable AI, transparent logic, a system that told users not just what it decided, but how and why it decided. And then, yes, I allowed that opportunity to be diluted. I allowed our machine of efficiency to override our mandate of responsibility. It wasn't malicious, but it was avoidable, and that makes it mine to carry. There were no theatrics, no outbursts of emotion, just truth delivered with precision." He turned now to the jury. "I could stand here and tell you that the executive who stripped the features was reprimanded, that the internal systems have been restructured, that we've since restored the full Ethic AI functionality and open-sourced the transparency modules for public use. And all of that would be true, but that's not why I'm here." He paused. "I'm here because Nima trusted me with her vision. She handed me a compass, and I dropped it. And while no one died, and no crimes were committed, something valuable was lost, integrity, and that loss matters." The room was still. "I believe that leadership isn't about making perfect decisions. It's about owning imperfect ones, and then doing the work to make them mean something, not just for shareholders, but for students, teachers, developers, and citizens who live in a world increasingly governed by the decisions we embed into software." He stopped speaking, not because he had nothing more to say, but because he knew when to let silence do its work. The judge nodded. She didn't smile, but her eyes were warmer now, not lenient, just human. The jury was dismissed to deliberate. The media waited outside, desperate for a soundbite, but inside no one moved quickly. They sat for a moment, lingering in the afterglow of something rare, a trial that had not just tested legality, but explored humanity. In the days that followed, public opinion began to shift. Not entirely, and not unanimously. There were still critics. There were still headlines branding the trial as strategic vulnerability or well-crafted PR. But beyond the cynicism, something quieter was happening. Law students began analyzing the case not for its outcome, but for its process. Ethics professors introduced it into their curricula. Tech firms initiated internal audits of their own. AI transparency modules. Something had shifted. Something had spread. And in her private chambers, Judge Clarissa Holt began writing what would become one of the most quoted closing summaries in the modern history of digital law. "Justice," she wrote, "is not always found in the verdict. Sometimes it lives in the courtroom moments where truth is spoken without fear of consequence, where power is held accountable by the very voice that wields it. This trial was not about punishing a failure. It was about witnessing a restoration. And that makes it not only lawful, but necessary. The verdict echoes. The day of the verdict arrived not with drama or tension, but with a strange kind of sacred silence. By now, the world had watched every second of the trial, dissected every argument, and weighed every admission like jurors of public opinion. Yet inside the courtroom, the quiet was personal. It wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about completion. Something real had been built here, not just a defense, but a different kind of architecture, one that wasn't made of code or laws, but of honesty, humility, and the raw willingness to be changed by the truth. Mark Zuckerberg sat motionless at the defendant's table, his hands clasped lightly, eyes calm. He had already made peace with any outcome. His performance was never about personal redemption. It had been a vow to himself, to his company, to Nima Amari, and to everyone who had ever questioned whether power could be held without arrogance. The jury filed in slowly, their faces unreadable. Some clutched notepads. One held her breath. The foreman, a former teacher, rose and handed the slip of paper to the bailiff. Judge Holt opened it quietly. She read the verdict with deliberate calm. On the charge of unethical alteration of proprietary code for commercial gain, this court finds Meta not guilty of willful breach. However, this court acknowledges and affirms the ethical damage caused by the company's internal mismanagement. The defendant's conduct, while not criminally negligent, constitutes a moral failure of stewardship. We urge regulatory bodies to further evaluate ethical protocols in high-impact tech acquisitions moving forward. No dramatic reactions followed. There were no cheers, no gasps. Just a wave of something more profound than celebration. Clarity. The verdict did not exonerate nor condemn. It clarified. And in doing so, it became something rare in legal history, a judgment that restored trust without stripping accountability. Judge Holt added a closing remark, one that would later be etched into the pages of law reviews, leadership books, and digital ethics lectures for decades. Today, the law ruled. But tomorrow, let us not forget who we're building for. Technology should never outpace our conscience, and leaders should never outgrow their willingness to be taught. Outside, the media scrambled to package the story. Some called it a soft verdict, others a landmark decision. But none could quite capture the undercurrent running through the people who had been watching closely, not for controversy, but for example. In university classrooms, young coders spoke of the trial like a cultural reckoning. On message boards and private Slack groups, engineers who once silently questioned their company's direction now found the courage to raise their voices. And within Meta itself, something irreversible had begun to take root. 1 week after the verdict, Mark called a global town hall. Over 80,000 employees tuned in, developers, designers, product managers, moderators, interns. This time, he didn't address them from a stage or a polished video stream. He sat at a round table with a handful of junior staff, some of whom had openly criticized Meta's direction in recent years, and gave them the mic. "This isn't a victory speech," he began. "It's a permission slip. You don't need to be the CEO to speak up. You don't need a title to defend what's right. You just need to be in the room and willing to say the thing others are too afraid to." What followed was not a Q&A. It was a conversation, a culture recalibration. Employees talked about what transparency looked like in their teams, how data ethics could become part of onboarding, how even low-level coders could be empowered to flag problems without fear. And Mark, for once, was not the speaker, but the listener, the learner, the architect of a new kind of hierarchy, where truth moved in all directions, not just top-down. The ripple effect spread fast. Other companies took note. Within months, a half-dozen tech giants released their internal ethics playbooks, and several began retraining product teams in bias-aware development and impact-first architecture. Conferences that once worshipped innovation began carving out space for humility, and it was no longer enough to build the next big thing. Engineers were being asked what problems they were solving and what values they were preserving, but not everyone was ready for that change. Venture capitalists grumbled. Some traditionalists called the movement idealism wrapped in policy. Others feared that slowing down for ethics would cost too much, and yet the tide could not be turned back, because something far more valuable than money had been unearthed: trust. For Nima Amari, the post-verdict days were surreal. She was offered interviews, book deals, advisory roles, but she declined most of them. She didn't want to become a mascot for someone else's redemption arc. She wanted to build, quietly, powerfully. She took her restored codebase and launched Glassbox, an open-source platform dedicated to making transparency modules standard in every public-facing algorithm. It wasn't flashy, but it worked, and within the first 6 months, Glassbox had over 40,000 downloads and implementations across education, finance, healthcare, and digital governance. Mark made a personal donation to the project, quietly, without announcement. And when asked later in an internal meeting what he had learned, most from the trial, his answer wasn't rehearsed. "I learned that the only legacy worth building is one that makes you replaceable. If people can carry the truth without needing you in the room, you've done your job." Judge Holt went on to lead a federal advisory committee on AI ethics in government systems. Her closing quote from the trial became a national reference point in debates around AI law, cited in Congress and referenced in regulatory hearings across the European Union. She had seen the future of tech not through code, but through courage, and it had changed her jurisprudence forever. Months later, the courtroom itself became the subject of a documentary titled "The Trial That Rewrote Trust." It didn't dramatize the courtroom moments. Instead, it showed the slow burn of accountability, the pain of personal reflection, and the discipline of quiet transformation. It wasn't a viral hit, but it became required viewing in ethics courses from MIT to Nairobi. And what of Mark Zuckerberg? He didn't become a lawyer. He didn't change careers, but something in him had shifted. The man who once built faster than anyone else was now walking slower, but seeing farther. He began mentoring young founders not just in how to scale, but how to pause. He spoke less at product launches and more at ethics symposiums. And when asked if he'd ever speak at a courtroom again, he simply said, "Only if I can learn something new." Legacy, after all, was no longer about what he left behind. It was about who he left empowered, and the courtroom that once laughed when he said he'd defend himself now remembered the moment not as irony, but as the beginning of something. Just the people who were watching change rarely begins where the spotlight lands. It doesn't start on stages or inside courtrooms or boardrooms. It begins in whispers, in quiet decisions made by people who weren't part of the story, but who saw enough to believe that the story might belong to them too. In the months following the trial, as the media frenzy died down and the courtroom echoes faded into headlines of the past, something more permanent began to take shape. Far away from the headlines, beyond the suits and sound bites. It was in classrooms, late-night cafes, cluttered co-working spaces and family kitchens, where people remembered what they saw, and then quietly began to live differently because of it. In a small town outside Accra, Ghana, a young software developer named Kojo watched every minute of the trial on a second-hand laptop he had repaired himself. His friends had mocked him at first. "Why are you watching a billionaire squirm in court?" they asked. He'll walk away untouched, just like the rest. But Kojo had seen something they hadn't. It wasn't about whether Mark won or lost. It was about how he stood still while his flaws were examined publicly. Kojo had grown up, thinking that power always silenced criticism, but here was a man who absorbed it, openly, patiently, and something about that rewrote Kojo's entire framework for what success could look like. He took that inspiration and decided to act. He had spent the last 3 years developing a mobile education platform for rural schools, but had hesitated to pitch it publicly. He feared judgment, he feared rejection, but now, for the first time, he believed that transparency was not a threat. It was strength. He began sharing the flaws of his platform in developer forums, openly asking for help, for critique, for accountability. What happened shocked him. Developers from 6 countries offered to assist. A professor in Finland sent him optimization tips. A woman from Brazil translated the app into Portuguese. Within 5 months, his platform was being used in 7 villages across Ghana, teaching over 4,000 students math and science with locally tailored content. And when a local newspaper asked what sparked the change, Kojo didn't talk about technology. He said, "I saw a man in a courtroom who admitted he got it wrong. That gave me permission to try before I was perfect." Thousands of miles away, in Austin, Texas, a single mother named Julia sat at her dining table, surrounded by bills, a broken washing machine, and the weight of years spent trying to get a better IT job. She had applied to over 70 roles and had been rejected each time, not because she lacked knowledge, but because she lacked a formal degree. She watched the trial clips between shifts at the diner where she worked. What struck her wasn't the legal arguments or the drama. It was that Mark had used his platform not to defend success, but to expose the gaps within it. She watched the scene where he admitted to mistaking complexity for integrity, and something in her shifted. She realized that her story, too, had a value not because it was perfect, but because it was real. She wrote a letter, not to a company, not to a boss, but to her 12-year-old daughter. It read, "When you build something, remember that it's not the smartest person who makes the biggest impact, it's the most honest. And never wait until you're invited into the room. Walk in, speak up, and don't be afraid to tell the truth about what you don't know yet." That letter went viral. It was later read aloud at a TEDx youth event and translated into 6 languages. But Julia didn't care about that. All she wanted was for her daughter to grow up knowing that courage isn't loud, it's consistent. Meanwhile, in New Delhi, a college professor named Dr. Abhinav Rai redesigned his entire technology and ethics course after streaming the trial with his students. For years, he had taught philosophy through Plato, Kant, and the utilitarian calculus, but none of it had resonated like what the students saw in that courtroom, where a tech mogul chose confession over conquest. He built a new syllabus around real-world ethical decisions in tech and invited his students to not just study past thinkers, but to create living codes of conduct for the startups they hoped to one day build. In the final assignment of the semester, his brightest student submitted a statement that would stay with Dr. Rai for the rest of his teaching career. It read, "What I learned is that leadership doesn't mean never failing, it means not hiding when you do." Even within Meta itself, the impact became more than procedural. Yes, the company restructured parts of its ethics pipeline. Yes, they created a new public ledger of feature modifications to foster transparency in AI decisions. But something deeper happened, something cultural. Engineers began writing internal posts, not just about what they were building, but why. Team leaders hosted sessions called silent redesigns, where everyone was invited to admit past mistakes and propose better frameworks. Even interns were given mentors not just in engineering, but in ethics, not because they were expected to be perfect, but because they were expected to care. And then there were the whispers. At hackathons, young developers in Nairobi whispered, To one another, build like the trials watching. At robotics clubs in Tokyo, teenagers created a sticker that read, "Complex Ethical," and stuck it to their laptops. At a technology high school in Detroit, a group of girls coding their first app kept a poster on the wall that read, "Truth in, Trust out." They didn't know Mark, they hadn't met Nima, but they had seen something powerful and rare, a man who had everything to lose and still chose to speak plainly. Back in Menlo Park, Mark Zuckerberg declined most interviews about the aftermath. He didn't want the attention. He understood something now that he had never fully grasped in the early days of Facebook. That influence, when unguarded, becomes intoxication. But when asked privately by a group of early Meta employees how he felt about the way the trial had echoed across industries, across oceans, across lives, his answer was simple. "I didn't want to be believed. I just wanted to be believed. Enough that others would feel safe telling their stories too." And they did, not because the world had become perfect, but because someone with power had stood in its imperfection and refused to run. The legacy, not written in code. The passage of time has a way of dulling headlines and silencing applause. The news cycle moves on. Companies rebrand, technologies evolve, and the public's memory, for all its sharpness in the moment, softens like fog retreating from a morning lake. But some events, especially those driven not by scandal or spectacle, but by moral clarity, leave behind a different kind of legacy. Not one etched in awards or commemorative plaques, but one that lodges quietly in the way people lead, the way they question, the way they dare to tell the truth, even when silence feels safer. The trial of Mark Zuckerberg had long ended, but its true outcome had only just begun. Years had passed. Meta had continued to innovate, its platforms now redesigned with visible ethical scaffolding embedded into their frameworks. Every major system now carried a lineage of logic, a built-in transparency tree that allowed users, regulators, and developers alike to trace how decisions were made, from data input to outcome delivery. The Ethic AI modules Nima Amari had created had not only been reinstated, but expanded, revised, and released into the public domain. Universities taught them, startups modeled their own frameworks on them, governments requested consultation on their integration. But more importantly, the very idea of open ethics had taken root in a generation that was quietly, but insistently, reclaiming what technology could mean for humanity. Mark had stepped back, not from responsibility, but from visibility. He no longer sat at the helm of Meta in the traditional sense. A younger leadership team, shaped by the fire of that trial and the cultural shifts that followed, now carried the operational mantle. But Mark's presence was never gone. He had become something else entirely. An elder of the digital world, a mentor not just to technologists, but to ethicists, educators, and public servants. Not because he had the right answers, but because he had lived the hard questions. He spent his days less in boardrooms and more in circles, real and virtual, where young creators wrestled with dilemmas of impact. He visited universities, not as a speaker, but as a listener. He responded to letters from high schoolers, building civic apps in cities he'd never been to. He hosted quiet roundtables, where people who had once felt locked out of tech spaces could now reimagine them freely. And above all, he wrote, journal entries, essays, unpolished thoughts that never made it to social media but were passed among students like folklore. One of them, written on the 10th anniversary of the trial, read, "If you ever find yourself in a room where no one is asking questions, be the one who raises your hand, not to challenge for applause, but to remind everyone, else that silence is not the same as agreement, and agreement is not the same as peace." In one particularly moving instance, Mark was invited to an elementary school in a quiet neighborhood outside Oakland, where students had used Meta's open-source tools to build a small AI that translated local government notices into 5 languages. Spoken by immigrant families in their community, the principal, unsure whether the billionaire would actually show up, had extended the invitation on a whim. But Mark came. He spent 3 hours with the students, asking more questions than he answered. At the end of the visit, one child asked, "Are you still the boss of Facebook?" Mark smiled gently and said, "No, but I helped build it, and now I help people build better things than I ever imagined." That answer made its way to forums and think pieces, but its real impact was on the students themselves, one of whom, an undocumented refugee, later wrote a speech for her graduation in which she said, "I used to think I needed permission to lead. But then I saw someone powerful admit he had been wrong, and I realized that power isn't about being right. It's about being real." Meanwhile, Nima Amari's work had taken on a life of its own. Glassbox, the organization she had founded, after the trial had evolved into a global cooperative, part research institute, part civic accelerator, part watchdog. It had no headquarters. Its members spanned more than 30 countries. It operated without hierarchy, guided instead by rotating councils and consensus. It wasn't just protecting ethics in technology, it was redefining what it meant to innovate, without extraction. One of its most notable achievements came when it successfully partnered with multiple public education systems to create transparent student assessment tools that eliminated algorithmic bias based on income, race, or geography. The results were extraordinary. Academic placement equity improved by over 40% in pilot schools. In an interview for a global education summit, Nima was asked what she believed had made her mission so successful. She didn't speak about funding or code. She said, "Because we didn't wait for the world to agree with us. We started building as if it already did. And yet, amid all this, there remained a quiet thread tying it all together. The courtroom, that one week when the world paused long enough to witness a kind of courage we don't often associate with billionaires or tech moguls or courtroom dramas. Not the courage to dominate, but the courage to deconstruct oneself publicly, to give others permission to lead by showing them that real leadership often starts with admitting where we fell short. There's a story, almost myth now, that's told in coding boot camps and legal ethics classes alike. They say that once a year, Mark Zuckerberg returns to the very courthouse where he once stood on trial, not for a scheduled event or public recognition, but simply to walk the halls. He sits quietly in the gallery of Courtroom 214, closes his eyes and listens, not to a case but to memory, the laughter that greeted his initial self-representation, the silence that followed his admission of failure, the unspoken understanding between adversaries who had chosen responsibility over revenge. He listens not to dwell, but to remember the sound of a world turning, slowly, honestly, beautifully, towards something better. No cameras follow him, no press waits at the exit. He leaves the same way he arrives, unannounced, because he knows. Now, what few people with his level of power ever realize, that real change never arrives with noise. It settles into people, into institutions, into the next generation. And years from now, when the names of companies fade and the technologies we use are replaced, there will still be students raising their hands, developers checking their code. For bias, leaders choosing truth over performance. Not because Mark Zuckerberg won a case, but because he stood for once, not as the architect of the world, but as its student.